All right, welcome back again. It's so good to be with you today. And we are going to talk about the fight, flight, or freeze response in marriage. Right? So this is a response that many of us hear about. It's kind of a survival instinct that happens often when we perceive danger. And so many couples exhibit these responses in their relationship without even realizing it each day. So we're going to go over that today. We're going to talk about those responses. We're going to talk about things that you can do to have better responses to conflict than fight, flight, or freeze. So stay tuned. All right, the fight, flight, and freeze response. Now, you've probably heard about this, seen this a lot online. If you've ever studied human psychology or sociology, these are terms that often come up. We learn about them in the medical field. These are terms that we talk about very frequently. And I wanted to talk with you today about how I see it in the clinical office as I'm working with couples, how I see these responses exhibited. And I want to help you determine if you exhibit some of these responses in your relationship, or if your partner exhibits some of these responses, why those responses might exist, and things that you can do to resolve conflicts a little bit more productively than the fight, flight, or freeze response. So let's jump in a little bit first just to the science of what's going on with fight, flight, or freeze. When we talk about these reactions, what's happening? Well, let's begin with the amygdala. Now, the amygdala in the brain is a region of the brain primarily associated with emotional processing. The name amygdala is derived from the Greek word amygdale. It just means almond because of its almond-like shape. The amygdala is located in the medial temporal lobe, just anterior to or in front of the hippocampus. And the amygdala is commonly thought to form the core of a neural system for processing fearful or threatening stimulus. This includes the perception of threat, right? If I perceive a threat, the amygdala gets triggered. When the amygdala gets triggered, it sends a distress signal to the hypothalamus, which activates the sympathetic nervous system. It does this by sending signals through the atomic nerves to the adrenal glands. Those glands respond by pumping hormone epinephrine, which is also known as adrenaline, into the bloodstream. And when adrenaline gets pumped into the bloodstream, we go into our fight, flight, or freeze response, right? It's a biochemical reaction that comes from a trigger in the brain that says there's a problem, and it's a big one, and you should react big, right? And it's how that system gets triggered, our sympathetic nervous system, which leads to that fight, flight, or freeze response. So let's begin with fight then. Let's begin with, what is the fight response? Now, this one's fairly intuitive to understand. The fight response is just what it sounds like. A person responds with anger and aggression, typically, right? So they get into a pose of don't mess with me, and they fight with their partner, right? So they're proactive, aggressively, in your face, engaged in a conflict. So this can look like things like harsh words, name calling, criticizing your partner, maybe even using foul language in the interactions. This can be volatile behavior, right? So throwing things, stomping around the house, maybe puffing up the chest, right? Tension in the arms, in the face, right? These types of responses. When you take a look at John Gottman's 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, right? Those 4 things that he says are so destructive in conflict. The fighter typically does 3 of them, right? So they're critical, they're very defensive, and they're very contemptuous, right? So they think about their partner in contemptuous and kind of enemy type ways. So this is the fighter. I worked with a gentleman who was a fighter. And when we would bring up things in session that were sensitive to him, things that he perceived critically, right, he would go into this fight response. And it was really tough for him. You know, he would grip his chair, and you could see in his arms, right, all these muscles flexed. He'd get a stone face, right, his jaw would be clenched. When he would talk, there would be pressure behind his speech. He would often talk in elevated tones. He wasn't hurtful to his spouse physically, right? He wasn't attacking her or physically harming her, but his whole demeanor looked like somebody that you had cornered who was ready to at any moment go off in the sessions. And we really helped him learn how to calm his central nervous system using deep breathing strategies, We talked with him about reframing. It was so important to help him reframe because, as you'll remember, the amygdala in the brain that stimulates the hippocampus, that releases the adrenaline, that causes kind of this fight, flight, or freeze response, right? That process happens with the perception of an attack. So it doesn't mean that there has to be an actual attack for a person to perceive one and become reactive. Once they perceive it, the biochemical response happens and boom, here's the response. So helping this gentleman learn a combination of calming his central nervous system through deep breathing, right, and bringing down his emotional state, as well as reframing what's happening with his wife, really helped him in choosing different behaviors during a conflict, right? So that's an example of a fighter. And you know that you have a fighter on hand because they get pretty assertive and sometimes even aggressive in a conflict. They're very in your face, they're very confrontational, they don't want to back down in the interaction. And oftentimes they're also referred to as a pursuer. So if you hear about marriage counselors or professionals talking about a pursuer-distancer dynamic, this is typically the pursuer. Now, if you determine that you or your partner is a fighter, you should check out two different resources that we have. One is our whole module. It's a video course that talks about reducing the volatility in conflict and ways in which a person can do that and alternative behaviors to the fight response. We also have a great YouTube video called How to Deal with a Defensive Partner. So if you're the spouse of an individual who's a fighter in conflict, this is a great video. It helps kind of walk you through how to help de-escalate that individual in a way that's more conducive to problem resolution. Now, if you have a partner who becomes physically or emotionally violent during an interaction, right? So they're taking this fight response and they're escalating into violence verbally or physically in the relationship, please get some help, right? One of the best ways to do that is to call 911. I'll put the domestic violence hotline in our description as well. I want to make sure that you're safe and you're okay. Sometimes fighters can escalate into places that are very damaging to the wellness and the welfare of their partner. And if that's your case, definitely let's get some help. So that's the fight response, right? It's any time that a person's triggered in such a way that their response is to become very defensive and very critical with their partner, sometimes in a contemptuous type of way. That's a fighter. Now we want to keep in mind that underneath all that anger typically is a primary emotion because anger is a secondary emotion. So a primary emotion like sadness or hurt or disconnect or feeling judged or criticized, that's usually what's going on, but the person's just not able to be vulnerable with that kind of feeling yet. And so they trigger into this fight response. So that's a fighter. All right, so let's switch now to flight response. What is flight response? So typically how flight response shows up in the relationship is through withdrawal, right? So a person will withdraw from their partner. They'll take a step back in the relationship, typically disengaging the interaction. So when they perceive a problem, a high conflict in the relationship, and the sympathetic nervous system thing happens inside of them, they typically are taking a step back in the relationship. They're withdrawing away from their partner. So you'll see this with avoidance, right? That the conflict, the partner will not want to engage the conflict. They may go hours, maybe even days without revisiting the conflict. Sometimes they never want to bring the conflict back up. Stonewalling sometimes happens. This is one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse as well that Dr. John Gottman talks about. Stonewalling is when I'm using distance and withdrawal on purpose as a control measure in the relationship, that I'm not allowing things to resolve in the relationship. And the person who's a flight risk, they're not always using stonewalling. Sometimes they just don't know how to re-engage the conflict in a productive way to solve the problem. And so they just keep avoiding it, trying to keep the peace. But stonewalling is when I'm using that avoidance as a control measure. I know that it's hard on my spouse and I want it to be hard on them for punishing reasons or otherwise. And so I stonewall them in the relationship. I don't give them the time of day. I ignore them on purpose. Not all people that are flight risks in a relationship are doing that type of stonewalling. Oftentimes, in fact, I found a majority of times, individuals just don't know how to resolve the conflict productively. And because they don't know how to resolve the conflict productively, they just keep avoiding the conflict, which in the short run can sometimes help keep the peace. but in the long run, it doesn't really help us work through things in a meaningful way. It doesn't really give the interaction resolve. Another thing that I'll note is that our fighters in relationships, they're typically extroverts. And our flighters, right, those individuals who have the flight response, they're typically more introverts, right? So the extrovert wants to socially engage the conflict, and the introvert oftentimes wants to socially avoid. So that's not always the case, but it might be a good sign that you or your partner are an introvert if you have this flight response often. And as I mentioned earlier, this person's typically the distancer in a pursuer-distancer dynamic that's going on. So it's common sometimes that couples will have a fighter and a flighter. So the fighter kind of wants to pursue the conflict toward resolution in kind of an aggressive manner. They don't typically do it in an assertive manner. And the flight individual typically is trying to avoid. And so they're kind of chasing each other around in the relationship in this way. You might run into that sometimes. Two fight responders oftentimes have a pretty volatile interaction, right? So you have two people who don't want to back down, who are very loud and in your face, right? And these ones can get into high risk for domestic violence situations if we're not careful. Two flighters, right? They don't have a lot of verbal external conflict, but oftentimes there's great tension in that relationship, and tension that builds and snowballs over time because it never really gets to resolution. We never get to reframe and refocus and recenter in the relationship. So if you or your partner is a flight responder in conflict, there's a couple of resources that I would suggest. One is our Advanced Communication Strategies video course. This one goes into communication strategies that are extremely helpful to replace that flight and avoidant response. The other one is our YouTube video called Save Your Relationship from Gridlock. And this is a great one that has you kind of take a look at what are steps that you can take to proactively resolve the conflict that you're facing versus just withdrawing it. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of times people who are flight risks in the relationship, that they tend to avoid conflict, they're doing it because they don't know great and productive and healthy strategies for resolution. So learning some of those resolution strategies can be super helpful for them. Okay, the final response is the freeze response. Now, the freeze response is just what it sounds like. In a conflict, a person freezes up. Right? They don't know how to respond. They're physically present, but they're relationally disengaged. So they're not like the fighter in that they're super assertive and aggressive and in your face, but they're not like the flight person as well. They don't run away from the interaction, right? They typically stay present. They just don't know how to engage the conflict, right? So they'll look frozen. They have a tendency toward inaction. They're typically there and their partner can get frustrated, like, do you have anything to say? Like, what do you want to do about this issue? Like, how do we make it stop, right? And this person typically, sometimes will even make eye contact with them, but has no idea what to respond with. They're kind of like, right? Like, and they'll kind of freeze up in that interaction. Maybe they'll say a few words, but they don't really know what to say. And the reason this is happening is because typically they're emotionally and cognitively flooded, right? So in their emotions and in their cognitions, they're feeling flooded by the conflict. They're having a hard time processing fast enough to really know what to say or how to respond in a way that helps the conflict resolve, right? So they're just kind of frozen in this interaction. And if they have a partner that typically goes into flight mode, right, their partner will typically become frustrated at their lack of responsiveness and disengage, right? They'll go into a different room and they'll be irritated and frustrated that the person who's frozen isn't responding, right? And if you have a fight partner, a partner that goes into fight mode, typically that individual will become increasingly irritated and critical and frustrated, kind of like, why won't you talk to me, right? Like this type of a response. Both individuals are getting frustrated with the person who's in freeze, right? But they don't know how to engage them. And so one is withdrawing, the other one's kind of coming on with more attacking dynamic in the relationship, right? And the freeze person they want to do well. They're not meaning to cause a problem. They're just having a really hard time processing all that's coming at them and knowing a productive way to respond. So that's the freeze response. So one of the resources that can be really helpful for somebody who's in freeze response is how to create change in your relationship. This is a YouTube video that we put out. and can be really helpful tips and tricks to kind of create that change in relationships that can reduce this freeze response. Another resource is the 4 questions for improved conflict resolution in your marriage. This is another YouTube video that's an excellent resource if you or your partner deals with this freeze response, so you can check that out as well. I hope this is a helpful overview of the fight, flight, and freeze responses that can happen in relationships. My goal is to help you learn more effective strategies for resolving your conflicts, that we can get out of these responses, and that we can go through conflicts with less of that sympathetic nervous system being triggered, right? If we can see conflicts as an opportunity to resolve toward greater connection, right, versus seeing conflicts as an attack from an enemy that I must defend myself in and respond to for survival reasons, right? We want to be able to resolve conflicts in a peaceful, resolutionary manner that builds connection and attachment and fulfillment in your relationship over time. So I hope these explanations are helpful, and I hope these resources are helpful. In the comments, I'd love to hear if you've had experience with one of these responses, the fight, flight, or freeze responses in one of your relationships, or if you're aware of which one you go into in your conflicts. And if you have any questions that we can help with for additional resources, always feel free to reach out. I'm so grateful to be with you again today. Thank you so much for joining us. As always, like, subscribe, share our content. We want to help couples everywhere find greater fulfillment and happiness in their relationship. And we're so grateful for all the help and support that you give us along the way. It's so good being with you today. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I look forward to talking with you again soon. Take care.